We are so excited that some of PUSD's math teachers are going to be able to participate in lesson study. Hands down, lesson study is the most impactful professional development I've ever participated in. Even today, many years later, some of those lessons I learned at lesson study still impact my practice. Let's take a look at what lesson study looks like. Oftentimes as teachers, we're given a recipe. Here you go, try this out in your classroom. Here's the mathematical practices, now implement them into your classroom. Well, when we look at these things, it doesn't always make sense to us and it doesn't always fit our style or the students' needs that we serve. So for example, if we're given something like this, what does it mean to debeard muscles? And I don't use grams in my classroom, I use cups. Okay, so I need to work with teams. How do I make that work in my classroom? A lot of what we do as teachers can't just be a recipe. It's very nuanced. Some of the moves that we have impact things that we hadn't even thought of. For example, if we're using vertical whiteboards, how are we going to pass the marker? How do we make sure all students are thinking? Lesson study provides an opportunity for us to see this in real time and to test things out. Let's take a look at some of the differences between professional development normally and lesson study. Traditional professional development begins with an answer. Someone is telling us what we should do in our classroom. Lesson study, however, begins with a question, and it's a question the team asks about their students and the learning of math. Traditional professional development is content driven by an outside trainer, either somebody hired to come in and tell us how to teach, or maybe even by a math-tosa. Lesson study is content driven by and for the participant's inquiry. What do we wonder about and what do we want to try out in our classroom? Traditional professional development, relationships are top down. Some expert is telling us what to do and what will work in our classroom. However, in lesson study, relationships are reciprocal. There's an ownership of everything and everyone is an expert in the room. Traditional professional development, the research informs practice. This is what the research says and this is what you should do. In lesson study, practice is research. We get to look into something that's interesting to us and see how it plays out. Traditional professional development, those are called non-student days. Students are not present. Lesson study is real-time learning with students and all of the variables that go into that. Traditional professional development begins with students' deficits. They try to fix our students. Lesson study begins with student strengths, and we'll see this in looking at the focus students. There are quite a few countries who have lesson study as their only form of professional development. In fact, recently, when a couple of educators and educational leaders from the US went to go visit Japan, they asked them how they were able to get such great results, even based on not covering very much content. And the Japanese educators actually said, we get that research out of the US and then we can implement it into our classrooms. But they're able to see that in practice and how it works. Our lesson study is just going to be 2 days. The first day is going to be all about studying and planning. So we're going to look at those key ideas of the chapter or the unit coming up, and then we're going to in-depth plan a lesson. So we take the math content, the super important math content, and then we also look at this from an equity lens. Who are the students who are disengaged in our class? And what could we do to maybe get them more engaged? So we look into that just by focusing on a couple of students. And with that, we create a lesson hypothesis. That lesson hypothesis talks about both the math and the equity content. So in this case, this is one of our examples from our superstars over at Poway High. If we employ structured discussion moves while students are making sense of understanding two variable inequalities, then students will improve the development of their ability to share in class, as evidenced by participation in their teams. So we can see we've got the math goal in there. That two variable inequalities, that's going to be important. This is from an integrated 1 class, and we're going to see that again in integrated 2 and in integrated 3 with some big ideas in there. And then we also can see the structured discussion moves. We want these students to be able to share in class. One of the students we were looking at felt a little nervous to share in their teams, and so we use these structured discussion moves to take a look at that. So day 2 is going to be all about doing the lesson. So we teach the lesson in the class, and then everybody else is observing, either one of the focus students, the whole class, or maybe even a table. And then after that, we reflect. How did our ideas, how did our hypothesis play out? Did those structured discussion moves actually work with our students that we were observing? Let's take a look at what this looks like on the day of the lesson. This is the lesson hypothesis we just talked about, and this is in a classroom.
Okay, so each one of you has a responsibility. Then you will share with your group. Everybody needs to have or hear about all 4 of these. Any questions about where we're headed? We're all good? Answer these questions quickly and honestly. Share with your group. Go.
These are just some reflections on that particular lesson. All students had a chance to share multiple times throughout the lesson, and I think that held them accountable, which impacted their learning positively. I do believe that students were actively engaged in the lesson, and using these strategies intensified their understanding of the lesson. Those are just some of the reflections on that particular lesson. So when we create a recipe and when we co-create a lesson like this, it makes math delicious for students. Not only that, but if we've made a recipe like this before, maybe we'll try it again, and maybe it'll be with a different twist.